Hey there. Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a close look at Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow.
Oh, yeah. This one really makes you think about thinking.
It really does. I think one of the most interesting things about the book is that it was written by a psychologist who won a Nobel Prize in economics.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
it
fascinating.
really speaks to how deeply these thinking processes that he's exploring impact our lives.
I see what you mean.
And the main idea is that we're not always the rational masterminds that we like to think we are.
Mm.
Instead, we have these two systems of thinking constantly at play, and he names them System 1 and System 2.
Can you imagine, experiencing the world through these two different systems?
It's almost like having two minds.
Oh, wow.
So System 1 is like our autopilot. It's fast, intuitive, emotional.
Okay.
It's what helps you instantly recognize a friend's face across the street or react quickly in a dangerous situation.
Makes sense.
And then System 2, that's the one that steps in when we need to solve a complex problem or make a carefully considered decision.
So, when you're working on a tricky math problem.
Exactly. Or planning a trip or deciding between two job offers.
Yeah.
That's System 2 taking charge.
Gotcha. So it's slower, more deliberate, more logical.
Exactly.
So these systems are constantly interacting with each other, shaping how we perceive and respond to the world around us.
They do, and they often work together seamlessly.
Okay.
But sometimes they clash, and that leads us to make these predictable mental errors that Kahneman calls heuristics and biases.
I always think of those as mental shortcuts.
That's a great way to put it.
Like the rules of thumb that our brains use to make quick judgments, I imagine they can be pretty helpful in everyday life.
Absolutely. They're essential for navigating a complex world.
But I'm guessing they can also lead to some interesting biases.
They definitely can. And one of the examples that he gives is the law of small numbers,
Okay.
which illustrates how we tend to overgeneralize from limited information.
Oh, I can see how that would happen. Do you have any real world examples that illustrate this bias in action?
He tells a great story about advising the Israeli Air Force.
Oh, wow.
They were investigating why one squadron had a higher accident rate,
Hmm.
and they were looking for patterns in pilot behavior or training. But Kahneman realized that it was likely just random chance,
Okay.
and he persuaded them to halt the investigation,
Interesting.
potentially saving pilots from unnecessary self-blame.
I see. That's a powerful example of how our minds are kind of wired to seek patterns even when they might not actually exist.
Absolutely.
Now, thinking about the implications of these heuristics and biases, it seems like they could have a significant impact on how we process information, especially in a world that's just overflowing with it.
Think about how often we encounter information in snippets,
Yeah.
headlines, social media, posts, short news segments.
Right.
Our System 1 jumps in making snap judgments based on this limited data.
And sometimes that quick thinking leads to, well, faulty conclusions.
Exactly. So recognizing these biases could be incredibly valuable.
For sure.
Hmm.
Are there specific areas where this awareness could make a real difference in our lives?
Definitely imagine you're evaluating an investment opportunity.
Okay.
Do you base your decision on a hot tip from a friend or on careful research? Or think about reading a news headline. Do you take it at face value or do you dig deeper? Consider the source. Look for evidence to support the claim.
That's a great point. It's all about engaging system two to question those initial impressions
Exactly.
and making more informed decisions.
Another fascinating bias is the anchoring effect.
Anchoring effect.
It's our tendency to be swayed by the first piece of information we encounter, even if it's totally irrelevant to the decision at hand.
That sounds intriguing. Can you give me an example of how it works?
Picture this: participants in a study. They spin a wheel of fortune landing on completely random numbers.
Okay.
And then they're asked to estimate the percentage of African nations in the UN. Believe it or not, their estimates were heavily influenced by that random number.
Really? That's wild.
It's because our brains latch onto that initial piece of information that anchors, and it biases our subsequent judgments. We don't even realize it's happening.
So being aware of this anchoring effect could be crucial in situations like negotiations, where the first offer often kind of sets the stage for the entire discussion.
Absolutely. Understanding anchoring can be a secret weapon against manipulation.
Interesting.
Imagine someone trying to sell you something at an inflated price. If you know about anchoring, you're less likely to be swayed by that initial number, and you can negotiate more effectively.
It seems like recognizing these subtle biases could really empower us to make more rational and informed decisions.
It really does.
Now, I'm curious to learn more about the other heuristics that shape our thinking. What else does Kahneman explore in this realm?
Well, another one that really shapes our perceptions is the availability heuristic.
Okay.
It's all about how easily we can recall examples of something.
So the more readily examples come to mind, the
Yeah.
more likely we are to kind of overestimate their probability.
Exactly. Think about this. If you've just seen a news report about a house fire, you might suddenly feel like your own house is more likely to catch fire, even though the statistical probability hasn't actually changed.
Right. Those vivid and memorable events, they tend to stick in our minds
They do.
and influence our perceptions of risk.
Yeah, think about media coverage and how it shapes our fears.
Mm-hmm.
Are you more afraid of plane crashes or car accidents?
I'd have to say plane crashes, even though I know statistically they're rarer.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
I guess those images, they're just so striking.
That's the availability heuristic at work.
Interesting.
Plane crashes are highly publicized, they're visually dramatic, so they easily come to mind, even though car accidents are far more common.
So it's not just about the actual statistics. It's
Yeah.
about our personal experiences and how those shape our perception of what's likely to happen.
It really highlights the importance of stepping back and considering the broader context, not just what easily pops into our minds.
Hmm. And speaking of how our experiences shape our choices, let's delve into another fascinating bias loss aversion.
Oh yeah, this one's a big one.
Kahneman found that the pain of a loss tends to feel much stronger than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
It's true. Imagine losing $50. It feels bad, right?
Yeah.
But finding $50 probably wouldn't feel quite as good, even though it's the same amount of money.
So it's not just about the objective value.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the subjective experience of
Exactly.
gain or loss.
Loss aversion explains why we're often so reluctant to make changes, even when those changes are in our best interests.
I see.
Think about selling a losing stock.
Okay.
Logically, it might make sense to cut your losses,
Right.
but emotionally, it feels terrible to admit defeat.
So we become attached to what we have.
Yeah.
And the thought of losing it outweighs the potential benefits of letting go.
Exactly. And it plays out in so many areas, holding on to possessions we no longer need, staying in jobs that make us unhappy, or even clinging to relationships that have run their course.
It seems like recognizing this powerful bias could be a key to making bolder choices and embracing new opportunities.
Absolutely.
Now, earlier you mentioned framing effects. I'm curious to hear more about how the way choices are presented can influence our decisions.
Framing is incredibly powerful. It highlights how the way information is presented. The frame can dramatically influence our choices, even if the underlying options are identical.
Can you give me a concrete example of how framing can sway our decisions?
Imagine a medical treatment described in two different ways.
Okay.
One description focuses on the survival rate. Let's say 90% of patients survive.
Okay.
The other emphasizes the mortality rate. 10% of patients die. Logically, it's the same information.
Right. But emotionally, those two framings feel very different.
Exactly. And studies have shown that people are more likely to choose the treatment when it's framed positively, 90% survival, even though the other option is mathematically equivalent.
That's fascinating. It seems that our emotional responses to the way information is framed can easily override our rational understanding. Where else do we see this framing effect in action?
Think about advertising. A product might be described as 90% fat-free instead of 10% fat-free. Politicians use framing constantly, emphasizing certain aspects of a policy while downplaying others.
So recognizing framing effects is crucial for becoming more critical consumers of information.
Yeah.
It empowers us to see through manipulative tactics and make decisions based on a more objective assessment of the facts.
It really doesn't. Now, one of the most intriguing concepts in Thinking Fast and Slow is the idea that we have two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self.
That sounds intriguing. It seems to touch on the complex relationship between how we experience events and how we remember them later.
Exactly. The experiencing self is the one who lives through an event moment by moment, feeling all the emotions.
Okay.
The remembering self is the one who looks back and creates a narrative, a memory of that experience. And what's fascinating is that these two selves don't always agree.
So we might have an experience that's enjoyable in the moment,
Yeah.
but our memory of it might be shaped by how it ended or by a few key moments that stand out.
Exactly. Kahneman shares a study where participants endured two painful experiences of different lengths.
Ah.
The shorter experience was less painful overall, but it ended more abruptly. Guess which one they remembered more negatively?
I'm guessing the shorter one, even though it was technically less painful.
You got it. The ending of an experience seems to have a disproportionate impact on our memory of it.
That makes you think about vacations, right?
It does.
Like why some people choose to end them a day or two early, ensuring that the last memories are positive and relaxing.
It definitely makes you think about how we evaluate experiences.
Hmm.
Are we making choices based on how we'll feel in the moment or on how we think we'll remember the experience later?
It's a profound question
It is.
that touches on the very nature of happiness and well-being.
And speaking of happiness, Kahneman explores a concept he calls cognitive ease.
Cognitive ease is that like when things feel familiar and make sense to us.
You're right on track. Cognitive ease is that feeling of fluency. When our brains aren't working too hard, everything just seems to click.
Hmm.
But here's the catch to it. This feeling can sometimes lead to illusions.
Illusions. How can cognitive ease mislead us?
Well, we're more likely to believe something is true simply because it's easy to understand or because it's been repeated multiple times. Think about catchy slogans or those viral memes that get stuck in our heads.
Like those jingles from commercials.
Yeah,
Even if the product isn't that great, the sheer repetition makes it stick in our minds.
exactly. Repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity can create an illusion of truth. Our System 1 loves it when things feel easy and effortless.
So how do we counter these illusions?
That's where System 2 comes in. It's our inner skeptic, the one who can
Mm.
step back and say, wait a minute, is this really true? What's the evidence?
But System 2 is often described as lazy.
Right.
It prefers to take shortcuts and conserve energy.
That's true.
Yeah.
But we can train System 2 to be more vigilant. It's like a mental muscle that gets stronger with exercise. The more we practice critical thinking skills, questioning assumptions, demanding evidence, considering alternative perspectives, the more easily we can resist these cognitive illusions.
So it's about finding a balance
Mm-hmm.
between the effortless fluency of System 1
Yeah,
and the deliberate scrutiny of System 2.
precisely. And Kahneman introduces another fascinating phenomenon called priming. This is the idea that exposure to certain words or images can actually influence our subsequent thoughts and behavior without us even realizing it.
Priming sounds almost subconscious. Can you share an example of how it works?
Imagine you just read a story about a rude waiter.
Mm-hmm.
Later, when you go to a restaurant, you might be more likely to perceive your own waiter as rude, even if he's perfectly pleasant.
It's as if those words primed your mind
Mm-hmm.
to interpret the situation in a particular way.
Exactly. Priming highlights how interconnected our mental processes are. One seemingly unrelated thought or sensation can trigger a chain reaction of associations in our minds, shaping our perceptions and actions in subtle but powerful ways.
This idea of priming makes you wonder about the degree to which our environment and experiences shape our thoughts and behaviors.
For sure.
It's almost as if we're constantly being influenced in ways we're not even aware of.
It raises all sorts of questions about free will and the nature of consciousness. But from a practical standpoint, understanding priming can help us be more mindful of the information we consume and the environments we choose to be in.
Now, shifting gears a bit, I know Kahneman's work has also had a profound impact on economics. I'm curious to hear more about that aspect of his research.
You're right. Kahneman's insights challenge some of the fundamental assumptions of traditional economics, which often portray humans as perfectly rational actors who consistently make decisions in their own best interest.
But as we've been discussing, our decision-making is far more complex and nuanced than that. What are some of the key ways Kahneman's work has influenced economic thinking?
Well, traditional economics often assumes that people make decisions based on maximizing their own gains. But as we've explored, loss aversion shows that the pain of a loss can loom larger than the pleasure of an equivalent gain.
So we might make decisions that seem irrational from a purely economic standpoint,
Right.
but make perfect sense when you factor in our emotional responses to potential losses.
Exactly. And this has huge implications for understanding market behavior, investment strategies, and even public policy.
Interesting.
And since people might hold on to a losing stock longer than they should because the thought of selling it and realizing that loss is just too painful.
It's fascinating how these seemingly irrational behaviors can actually be predicted and understood when you factor in the psychological principles that Kahneman uncovered. Now, what about the concept of framing?
Yeah.
I recall you mentioned it earlier. How has that idea influenced economics?
Framing is crucial in understanding how people make choices in economic contexts. Remember that example of the medical treatments framed in terms of survival rates versus mortality rates.
Yes, the framing significantly influenced people's preferences, even though the choices were objectively the same.
Precisely the same principle applies to economic decisions, the way choices are framed, whether in terms of potential gains or losses, risks or rewards can drastically affect our preferences.
That makes perfect sense. Imagine choosing between two investment options.
Yeah.
One might be framed as having the potential for high returns,
hmm
while the other emphasizes the possibility of losing your initial investment. Even if the underlying probabilities are similar, the way those options are presented can sway our judgment.
Exactly. This highlights the importance of carefully considering how information is presented and not just accepting things at face value. We need to engage our system to analyze the underlying facts and make decisions based on a more objective assessment of the situation.
So understanding framing effects can help us make more informed decisions, especially in areas like investing where emotions can easily cloud our judgment.
Kahneman's work also has fascinating implications for happiness research.
Oh,
He's done extensive work on trying to understand what truly makes people happy.
I'm eager to hear about this aspect of his research. It seems to connect to our earlier discussion about the experiencing self and the remembering self.
You're right on track. Kahneman distinguishes between two types of happiness: experienced happiness and remembered happiness.
Okay.
Experienced happiness is how we feel in the moment, while remembered happiness is how we reflect on our lives as a whole.
So we might have an amazing vacation filled with exciting experiences,
Yeah.
but if it ends on a sour note, our overall memory of the trip might be tainted.
That's a perfect example. That one negative experience can overshadow all the positive ones.
This distinction makes you think about what we truly value when we reflect on our lives.
Hmm.
Are we chasing fleeting moments of pleasure, or are we trying to create a narrative that feels meaningful and fulfilling in the long run?
Exactly. And Kahneman suggests that we often prioritize the remembering self over the experiencing self. We make choices based on how we think we'll feel in retrospect, rather than on how we're actually feeling in the moment.
It's almost as if we're living for the story we'll tell ourselves later, rather than fully immersing ourselves in the present experience.
It's a thought-provoking idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it raises all sorts of questions about how we design our lives, make choices, and pursue happiness.
It certainly does. This deep dive into Kahneman's work has been incredibly enlightening. We've covered so much ground, from the dual systems of thinking to heuristics and biases, from framing effects to the complexities of happiness.
We have, and it's clear that Kahneman's insights have profound implications for how we understand ourselves and how we navigate the world.
But it feels like we've only scratched the surface.
Definitely.
There's so much more to explore in Thinking Fast and Slow.
It really is. So as we wrap up our deep dive into thinking fast and slow, what are some of the key takeaways that you think listeners should really hold on to?
Well, I think what really strikes me is how Kahneman really kind of dismantles our assumptions about rationality. We often think of ourselves as these logical beings,
Right.
but he reveals how profoundly emotions, cognitive shortcuts, and even the way choices are presented influence our decisions.
It's almost as if we have this illusion of being in control,
Yeah,
while our brains are constantly playing these tricks on us.
precisely. And understanding these tricks is the first step
Mm.
towards making more conscious and informed decisions.
So knowledge is power, in a sense.
Absolutely.
The more we understand about how our minds work,
Yeah.
the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of decision-making.
I completely agree. And Kahneman actually offers a range of practical strategies to help us kind of counteract these biases.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Well, for example, he talks about thinking the opposite.
Oh,
So when we're leaning towards a particular choice,
yeah.
it can be helpful to deliberately consider the counter arguments,
Oh,
to
interesting.
play devil's advocate with ourselves.
That sounds like a great way to challenge those initial impulses
Yeah,
and avoid falling prey to biases like the anchoring effect.
exactly. It encourages us to engage system to critically evaluate the situation rather than simply going with our gut feeling.
Another key takeaway is the importance of what Kahneman calls broad framing.
Okay.
Instead of getting bogged down in the details of each individual decision,
Yeah.
we should step back and consider the bigger picture. How does this choice align with our overall goals and values?
That's a crucial point, especially when dealing with risk and uncertainty.
Right.
Broad framing helps us avoid those short-sighted decisions, driven by fear or immediate gratification.
Kahneman also emphasizes the value of seeking outside views.
Oh, that's a good one.
When facing a tough decision, it can be helpful to consult with others to gain different perspectives.
It reminds me of the planning fallacy, our tendency to underestimate the time and effort needed for tasks. Getting an outside perspective can provide a much-needed reality check.
It's like we need to acknowledge our own blind spots and be open to other people's insights.
Absolutely. And this applies to all sorts of decisions, from personal goals to business strategies to even public policy.
thinking about the impact of Kahneman's work, it's incredible how this exploration of the two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, has shaped our understanding of happiness.
It really has that idea that we might prioritize the remembering self over the experiencing self.
Yeah.
Has really profound implications.
It does.
It suggests that we often make choices based on how we think we'll feel looking back, rather than on how we actually feel in the present moment.
It's like choosing a shorter, less painful medical procedure,
Yeah,
even though it might lead to a worse memory later on.
right. It raises questions about what truly matters to us.
Yeah. Are we living for the moment,
Mm-hmm.
or are we shaping our lives to fit a narrative we create in retrospect?
Such a complex and fascinating question.
It is.
And Kahneman's work provides us with the framework to begin exploring these profound ideas.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage everyone listening to pick up Thinking Fast and Slow
Absolutely.
and embark on their own exploration of cognitive biases.
It's a book that will challenge your assumptions, broaden your understanding of human nature,
Yeah.
and empower you to make more conscious and informed decisions.
It's a journey well worth taking.
Agreed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds engaged.
Yeah.
And remember to think about thinking